I initially enlisted when I was 17. My parents had to sign my documents for me, and I did delayed entry, so I started, I think, about 6 months after I turned 18. Went from Illinois down to Texas for basic training, and then I went to school to be aircraft armament, meaning fancy way to say you load bombs on planes and take care of the weapon systems. My first assignment was Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson before it was a joint base, so it was Elmendorf Air Force Base, and that's where I met my husband, working on the F-22 here. So we got married up here. It was initially we got engaged. 3 months later I found out I was pregnant. Then we got married. So we've been married about 12 years now. I have 2 kids. We went from Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. He had to go to New Mexico for a year. Then he came back up here, and then we both went from here to Whiteman Air Force Base, where we worked on the B-2. And I took a medical retirement after 11 years. And during that medical retirement, he went to Korea. Yep, so I was working full-time, active duty, going to school, taking care of 2 kids, putting them in daycare, and he was in Korea without me. Then he came back in April. So about 6 months prior to him coming back, I went to my mother's house because I was medically retired. My kids went down there, spent most of the school year there, and then we came up here to Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, and he is 3 years from retirement. So yeah, he's at 18 right now, but he's doing 21.
I would love to hear your thoughts on the really unique challenges that that dual military families walk through. Is it hard to kind of keep that sustainable op tempo of a dual military?
It really is. So we had to have contingency plans. So they call this family care plan, meaning if you were both to leave, who's going to watch your kids? How are you going to get them there? Are they going to come get them? When's the soonest you could leave? Step A all the way through, Z. If it falls out, what's your backup plan? And what's your backup plan to the backup plan? And then they're always asking, well, you have a family care plan. Why can't you just, both work the evening shift? It's like, that's not what a family care plan is intended for. And a lot of the supervision doesn't realize that. And then, so for us, aircraft mechanics, we work 24 hours, 5 days, and sometimes weekends. You have to be on call for the weekends. You just take your rotation. You work in 3 to 4 man crews. That's a little bit more difficult, so we spent a lot of time being on off shifts. I would take second shift, so swing shift. He would take day shift, sometimes night shift. When we left Alaska, we had to prepare for losing the amount of money up here. So we purposely did off shifts and swapped kids in between shifts. That way we could prepare for the loss of money that we were going to have for Whiteman Air Force Base. And that's probably one of our biggest challenges, is working the shifts and the schedules. And we were very fortunate in our aircraft that we didn't deploy all the time. We would really, out of here, it was Guam, Kadena, Aldafra, so nothing crazy. So we didn't have to worry about that brand new aircraft. They're not putting it in harm's way yet. And then the B-2, it could be sent from Whiteman, go do bombing, and then come right back. We wouldn't have to go anywhere. So I think the longest we were apart was 14 months, and that was his Korea trip. Other than that, it was months at a time, like 4 months, maybe a little bit longer, or as short as 2 weeks. And that happened quite often. So really, it wasn't any back-to-back deployments. Just because our supervision was nice, we got really lucky with who we had at that moment in time. And that was for a good portion. So I was working 40 hours a week, doing the VA benefits advisor. I was actually the site lead for JBEAR here. I have a husband who's active duty military still. I have a well, then 7-year-old. So this was like last January. A 7-year-old who's on an all-star cheer team. That means she spends 5 to 8 hours a week at the gym while going to school. And so I'm in college classes and it's my finals, so I'm graduating, and he deploys for 2 months. So really TDY. But he went to Vegas for a month and then he turned around and for another month he's in California. So he's gone about 2.5 months. My entire semester of school as I'm trying to finish and do finals and graduate. And that was really rough because my other daughter was on a swim team. So she has swim 4 times a week. So 5 days I'm at one place and then 4 days I'm at another, and I'm overlapping. I'm dropping kids off at swim practice, turning around and going to cheer practice, dropping the other one off, then going back and picking the other one up. And then I'm trying to do schoolwork in the car. So I had to buy the hotspot off AT&T just so I could do my schoolwork in the car during sports practices. And they've got homework and grocery shopping, and I started doing all my online orders so I could just pick it up between sports. And and then it's like, oh, well, we're gonna have to eat out tonight because I don't have enough time in my schedule. And they're like, oh, okay, let's go to Pizza Hut, and I was like, I don't even care, like, just do it.
It just feels so overwhelming sometimes.
It does, and that's where I think you have to find a network wherever you go. And a lot of times it was a little easier for me because I'm moving in, being active duty, and my husband being active duty. You network with the people that you work with versus, a normal spouse who doesn't have that instantly and has to find a job, or maybe they already had a job lined up, but you don't have that same relationship as we're all in this together. Let's enjoy the suck together. That's really the best way to put it. So for me, I got pretty lucky. Someone I worked with when I was in the military knew we were coming up here and offered me a job instantly. He's like, hey, Sarah, come work with me. So the transition for job-wise was a lot smoother for me. But being the military spouse now, it's like, oh, this is different. Like, you were always the military spouse because you were dual military, but it's not the same. So thank you for your service, whether it was directed at me or it was directed at him, fine, that was normal. Now it's like, oh, thank you for your service. Military spouses serve too. And it's like, oh, well, actually I was in too. And then it makes everyone in the room awkward, like, oh, you were? So I have a disabled vet tags. So if anyone sees them and my husband happens to be driving, they think they're his and he's still active duty. And he's like, actually, it's not me, it's her. So they ask him questions all the time. And I'm like, oh, well, that's not exactly the case. And it seems to always be that way. So that's kind of an adjustment. And then they want to go to work functions. And typically I would be really comfortable there. And now I'm not. It's so weird. I went to his senior NCO induction ceremony. His commander was someone I worked with on active duty. And so they're staring at me like, oh, I recognize you, but where do I recognize you from? And he was like staring at me, looked away, stared at me and looked away, like trying not to. And then he was like, Sarah? And I was like, yes, but no one had name tapes on, so no one knew who anyone else was. And he was like, didn't I work with you? And I'm like, yes. So now I talk to him more consistently. And I joined the Key Spouse program with them just for my husband to move squadrons.
Of course.
Yeah, so that was fun.
Have you found the transition, like, socially to be hard? Do you find that you still gravitate towards, like, being around active duty service members versus like the spouses and the families? Like, you feel more comfortable over there?
I do. It might be because my career field is very male-dominated career field for when I was in. So, I mean, we had, maybe 6 girls in a shop of 50. And so that is where my comfort level started growing. And now I'm out and it's like, oh, you work with mostly, when I was working as a VA benefits advisor, it's still military. So most of them are males. And now I'm working healthcare where the majority of them are females. So I made a huge jump there. But the spouse connection, it's almost like they look at you differently because you were prior service. And they're like, well, you really don't understand what I'm going through. And it's like, well, I kind of do. Because not only was I in your shoes, but I'm also in, so I can help you. And it's like, yeah, but you don't understand what it's like to be the new spouse, to look for new jobs. And I'm like, well, I just had to go through that from getting out, and then my husband moved, so I do understand that, you know. And so there's like a disconnect there. The first one was really rough because you have to be back at work. So 6 weeks after delivery, you were right back at work, your kids at daycare. Especially in a maintenance career field, if you choose to breastfeed, you can't work the flight line, meaning you have to be in an office environment, and they don't take kindly to that, ever. Yeah. So that's a big red flag right there. Maintenance doesn't like that, and that will probably never change because now they're filling a spot with someone who can't do the maintenance. Yeah. So if you want to do that, they're like, really? Like, you want to breastfeed? Yeah, they do not understand. And you're like, well, did your wife have the option? And they're like, well, yeah, she breastfed for, and I was like, exactly, so you don't want to allow someone else the opportunity? And they're like, okay. And then they have to do it anyway, it's not a question. But then they have to find an administrative role for you to take for however long you're breastfeeding for. If you were maintenance, most women didn't breastfeed unless they wanted to go through that battle of trying to find a different job for you to take.
And then what about childcare, or if you're both, like you said, like what happens if you were both on the same shift, or he's gone and you're working nights? Like, where are you putting babies at night, right? If you're working, and I mean, how was that to navigate?
So the daycare, it was easier when I was up here at J-Bear than when I went down to Missouri. In Missouri, they only have one child care center on base versus up here they have multiple. So space is limited, so you were probably trying to find something off base, which you may or may not like that provider, versus you know who's on base for the most part and can go in and see them, and they're all kind of set up the same way with Missouri did thumbprints to sign into the building, and signing people out in the classroom. And so we had a couple issues with daycare down in Missouri trying to get the kids in. They ended up at 2 different daycares. It was not happy. And then trying to find who can take an infant, and a lot of them are like, sorry, we don't take them until they're this age. And I'm like, what do you do with them before that?
Because they're going to go back to work, so yes. I have to do something with them. I can't take them to work with me.
Yeah, and a lot of them were 12 weeks. They'll take them at 12 weeks. And I was like, no,
I have
to go back at 6. Like, we have to do something.
It doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, so that was kind of a nightmare for a while. If I was on a second or third shift and he was leaving, they would have to move me shifts, because then I have to find someone to watch the kid at night, and unless you were really good friends with someone, that wasn't happening. Yeah, so they would move you. But then, even when he is here and you're working an opposite shift, you're not seeing him very often, and you're definitely not seeing your kids because they're still in school or daycare or
Yeah, so you're never really together. Even when he's home.
Yeah.
You're just passing, giving off kids and passing.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, well, I'll see you on the weekend. The most challenging thing is probably a PCS. So moving from one location to the next. That's probably the number one challenge. And then really deployments and TDYs and how often they have to go is a big challenge as well. Because even when it's like, oh, okay, you just went for, a month and then you're back. Well, are you going somewhere again in 3 months for even a week or 2 weeks, or how long? And then you never know when is the return date. And it's like, oh yeah, plan for this, and plan for 2 weeks later. Yeah. So you never know what's coming that way. So really having those discussions up front is probably the best thing that you can do. Knowing, what can you and can you not talk about with your spouse. We got lucky, same career field, we can talk that information back and forth, but a lot of times they can't, or you're going to talk to them and you have no idea what they're talking about. So we got lucky in that aspect, so that was really helpful. Those are probably the biggest challenges, but some of the most rewarding stuff that we've ever done is like seeing aircraft take off, bombs drop and it comes back empty. And so that is some of the best things that we've ever done, knowing exactly, where your bombs were dropped, how many bombs were dropped, seeing those videos. And sometimes they will allow spouses to come see those videos. It's just a matter of, clearance types and, and so they don't understand that aspect for the most part. And really the people is probably the most rewarding part as well. You make friendships that last forever. So, and it's the same in the spouse world as it is the military world. So I have friends from, 12 years ago, and I'll call them up and they'll be like, oh, hey, how are you? And you don't even have to have talked to them for years. I was cleaning out my phone the other day of all my contacts, and I messaged one of them and I was like, hey, is this still your number? And he's like, who is this? And I said, I didn't figure you had my number. I was like, this is Sarah. And he's like, oh my God, I haven't talked to you, in like 6 years. And we talked for a minute, chatting back and forth in text. And he's like, well, here's my schedule. Let me know yours after you start at the Cohen Clinic, and maybe we can meet up, because he's here in Alaska. So that is something we'll probably continue to do.
You got to go find your people.
Yes, very much so. Which is kind of why I joined that Key Spouse organization, because I was like, I'm not doing that. That's clicks. I'm not doing it. I'm not the military spouse, even though clearly I am. The program manager for that here is Christy Rodriguez. And she's like, no, Sarah, it's not like that. I promise, blah, blah. And so I finally did, and open arms, so welcoming, whatever you need. That's one of the frustrating parts for me now, because I used to get all that information and I was like, I don't need you for any of that. I know when all your stuff is, and now I'm like, oh, I gotta go get that.
Yeah. Wait, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, it's like, I know this should be coming up because I was active duty. And I'm like, what's going on there? And he's like, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you.